Hi, and welcome to Boom It's on the Blockchain. My name's Alistair Caithness. We're into series 4 of our podcast, and this is our 85th show. And today we've got a special guest, Jonathan Knight. How are you, Johnny?
Doing well, thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. So it's, I know time flies there. So, we've had Jonathan on in the past. He runs a renewable energy company, Uprise Energy. He's the CEO. And today, obviously, if you're anywhere in the world right now, the world's sort of been at war with its Ukraine and Russia, but things have been happening out in the Middle East, in Gaza and Israel as well. But the perspective we're going to look at outside sort of mainstream news is, climate change is obviously one of the biggest focuses in the world over the last, probably, 3 years, I would say. It got bigger and bigger in terms of profile. And now wars come along, and, how is this going to affect everything? So initially, what are your thoughts on it all then, Johnny?
Well, war is bad. I'm against war of all types. I think it's very unfortunate. I think that this the war beyond the unfortunate loss of human life, especially the innocents that are being wrapped up in this. It's derailing some of the important work that's taking place around the world. Specifically, there's been some collective efforts towards addressing the climate change issue, and this is likely to create some unfortunate interruptions in some of that progress that was being made. Not just interruptions, taking a step backwards. I haven't seen an environmental impact study on the impacts of war, but I think I can go out on a limb and say it's not good for the environment. So I think it's an unfortunate situation for a lot of reasons. But one thing that it is illustrating is the importance of having resilient and distributed power systems, something that we're working on and something that I personally believe is the future of energy.
So let me bring in this article first of all. So this is about, obviously, war in the Middle East. It jeopardizes climate talks. Initially, there was going to be a huge climate talks happening in Dubai next month. This is whereby they were going to be looking to reduce carbon emissions across all the Middle East countries. There was going to be a huge commitment from the likes of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, but across all the different Gulf countries itself. And there's talking about the whole Arabian Peninsula and what they're going to be doing. And then essentially it was going to be focused on what the impact of war from Ukraine and Russia and how this is not helping in terms of the climate warming up and the CO2 emissions caused by war. But what impact is that going to have on climate change? Because obviously energy security now becomes priority number one for these countries because they don't want to run out of energy and they want to be sort of secure in terms of being in control of their own energy, and how that sort of transitions in terms of renewable energy and climate change.
Well, you talked about the efforts that are taking place to address climate change in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and some of those other Middle Eastern countries. And I'll start by saying, from my own personal experience, having visited the Middle East a handful of times over the last few years, probably the thing that surprised me the most was the commitment towards a transition towards clean energy technologies. I think that the general assumption is that these are oil-rich countries who want to continue to sell oil, and they do, but they also are demonstrating a huge commitment towards transitioning towards clean energy technologies. In my business here at Uprise, I've been able to travel the world, and I've attended events all around the world, energy-related events. And to my surprise, at some of these early events was the presence that Saudi Arabia in particular had, and the United Arab Emirates was demonstrating towards their commitment towards clean energy. Now we have conflict around the world that's not only derailing those talks and those events that are to bring the world together to create a unified vision and approach towards addressing the clean energy. Now it's causing the world to potentially choose allies, choose sides. And so one of the major resources obviously around the world is energy. And that becomes an important lever that can be used for influence. And so that's an unfortunate predicament that we're finding ourselves in. So here, I feel like we've been on a trajectory of making progress, and now because of this conflict, it's interrupting that trajectory, and unfortunately, it looks like it's going to interrupt it in a negative way. So,
yeah, I agree with that as well. Now, the next article I'm going to sort of bring in, and what's interesting about this article isn't actually out now. This is actually from a few years ago. And it was talking about providing reliable and sustainable energy to the people of Gaza. Now, what was interesting when you're actually reading this article, and it's from the United Nations Office of Project Services. So it's a really good website. If anyone wants to look at how the energy problems countries are facing, this website provides details on it, the impact, and some of the programs that they're looking to implement as well. But this was like back in like 2006, and they're looking at Gaza has suffered from chronic electricity shortages. You know, it's difficult living conditions with the majority of nearly 2 million residents who live on just a few hours of electricity each day. The residents are only getting about 85 megawatts available each day. So can you explain a little bit in terms of what is 85 megawatts? What does your Uprise, we can see the Uprise machine at the back, what does it create, and where the shortages are?
Well, when you're talking about megawatts here, you're talking about providing the power for the entire region. You know, the average home in the US uses 1 kilowatt per hour, or roughly 24 kilowatt hours per day. A megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. So that's addressing the need throughout the region. But look, the access to reliable energy is what has facilitated the modern world. You know, every innovation that we look at that around us, you know, the computers that we're on, the lights that are in this room, the buildings, these are all here because we had access to reliable power. And so for those people around the world that don't have that access, well, they struggle, and pretty much all aspects of their life are hindered. Education, health, wealth, innovation. I mean, these are all things that when you don't have access to reliable power, that becomes a real hurdle towards achieving what the industrialized world is working towards. So, you know, it's you know, tying your hands behind your back if you don't have this resource. And so when you look at the difference between the haves and the have-nots in the world, whether it be Palestine or some third world areas of Africa or anywhere around the world where you don't have access to power, there's not a bigger differentiator between the haves and the have-nots than that access to reliable power. So if we want to bring the entire world up, everybody's got to have access to this fundamental resource. Shelter, food, water, energy needs to be added to that list.
Yeah, well, let me bring in this image as well, just to let people understand. So, that, you know, this is again from the article, providing reliable, sustainable energy to people of Gaza. But this is where a Jamal Juma, resident in Gaza, said they've had to use candle lights for lighting for the last 3 years. When it gets dark there, that's it. You're on candlelight. It's amazing to think that, and then that means no electricity and access to stuff as well, Johnny. It's just like you're going to be limited to what it is. But if you're going to candlelight, that means you've got no electricity, basically.
Well, sure. And what are you burning in order to achieve that candlelight? A lot of people are burning kerosene, which has toxic fumes, which, you know, get into your eyes and create eye disease and create lung disease and create a whole bunch of other problems beyond just the limitation of having to rely on candlelight for, you know, lighting in the darkness. it could be exacerbating the problem from human disease.
Whereby everything in the US or Europe, the way our energy system's created, it's relatively safe. When you start going into third world countries and you see, even for us in sort of San Diego, we can go across the border to parts of Mexico and just see the way they do the wiring on some of the buildings and parts in the poorer parts in Tijuana. It's like it's so dangerous. You just wouldn't get past any sort of health and safety that's here, and people don't think about that as well. They just, because you don't see it, so it's out of sight, out of mind for that as well. And they're talking about, their target was having 10% of Gaza with renewable energy by 2025, I think it was, around about that time period. So that's quite a large percentage for a country to have that coming in as a new energy source coming in. But talking about your machine that you've got there in the background, explain a little bit how it could get used for facilities like that and being brought into a place like Gaza. Like, how much energy could it create, and how does it actually work, John?
Yeah, so what we've developed is the world's first commercially sized portable wind turbine. So this is a 14 kilowatt wind turbine that folds up kind of like a transformer. And so the entire unit will fit into a 20-foot shipping container, making it very easy for us to manufacture here in San Diego, put it in a container, send it overseas, send it long distances. Container shipments are ubiquitous around the world, so it's easy to transport. When it arrives at the port, you can hook up to the wind turbine with your standard 3/4 ton pickup truck, so like your F-250 size pickup truck, and then you can tow it wherever you want to make the power. And if the tow vehicle can get there, well, the trailer can follow it. And then once you arrive at the site, well, the whole system can be set up in less than a half an hour by one person. And now the system will make energy from the wind. And in our case, since we are all about making the power where the people are, where the consumer is, we optimized our wind turbine for a much lower wind speed than traditional wind turbines because we're going after that distributed generation, meaning making the power where it's consumed. So we set the system up, the wind blows over the rotor, it takes the kinetic energy in the wind, it converts it to mechanical energy by spinning the rotor. That mechanical energy spins an alternator, which creates electricity. And then that electricity is either provided to the customer that needs it in real time, or it goes into an energy storage system, a battery bank that's integral in the trailer. It stores that electricity, and then it delivers it to the customer on an as-needed basis. One of the strong points that the war is illustrating is the decentralized distributed power generation. Because as we're talking about, energy is such a critical resource in a conflict. Those centralized power generation plants, so the big coal fire plants, the centralized nuclear reactors or centralized energy systems are going to become a target. So in times of conflict, if you can take out that centralized generation, you're going to disable a large region. Our system at 14 kilowatts, at that full output, that's enough to run 14 average US homes at full capacity without any interruption. Now, when you go to my home here in San Diego, where we're close enough to the water that we don't require air conditioning, well, my consumption is roughly half of the average. Then you go to a place like Gaza, where they don't have televisions in every bedroom and computers and multiple refrigerators and air conditioning and all all the luxuries that we have in the United States. Their consumption is going to be even less than mine in coastal San Diego. So where one of our wind turbines, could power a city block here in the United States, take it to Gaza, and I'm not familiar what their average consumption is, but I got to believe it's considerably less than what we use here. So one of these wind turbines could power a community. but these can be distributed around, so they're powering local areas, meaning if one of them gets taken out, well, there's redundancy, because ideally there will be more units that will be spread around the area that will make up for those individual losses. So that's definitely a strong point of the future of distributed energy. And in my mind, because of this resilience and because of the challenges of transporting power long distances from the point of generation to the point of consumption, the future is distributed generation. And in the energy world, I think that this is a very exciting time, because we have new technologies that facilitate this, whether it be the solar on the roof of our homes and our buildings, or a wind system like ours that can be run in the neighborhood, in the backyard, in the parking lot, what have you. Now you can make reliable, meaningful amounts of power on site, minimize the distribution challenge. So the sending the power from the point of generation to the point of consumption. And now you have small systems that are scattered all around. So if one of those small systems gets taken out, it's not devastating to the region. It's just part of a much larger spread out system, and which makes it far more resilient towards potential attacks.
Yeah, and then a thing to explain as well, because there'll be people going, "Oh well, what happens if it's not windy in Gaza?" But how much energy do you have in the backup battery storages on the unit when it arrives there? Because it's automatically energy the minute it arrives, Johnny, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. We deploy our turbines with the batteries fully charged up. So we can put 200 kilowatt hours of battery storage, which, to put that number in reference, that's my home in San Diego running at full tilt for an entire month. So, and that's if I don't generate another electron from the wind or the sun. But the reality is there's going to be some wind and some sun, and so we're going to be generating electricity during this period of time. So the energy storage system, one, it provides the immediate power that you referenced. So the minute you arrive on site, plug in, you get whatever power you want. Then you set up the wind turbine, and if you're in a sunny region, maybe you've opted to add solar generation to the trailer as well. So now you have the wind and the sun that are generating electricity that are keeping those batteries charged. And furthermore, when the community goes to sleep at night, the wind can still be blowing. And so you use the power during the day, you continue to charge at night, you wake up the next morning, your batteries are charged. So one of the downsides of renewable energy is the variability of it. You can't predict with certainty what the wind is going to do and what the sun is going to do. And so that's why having an energy storage system to buffer that power is critical.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And the next article I'm just going to bring in just now, Johnny, it's on this Scientific American, and it starts off. It's not easy to talk about climate change and carbon-free power when your country is a battlefield. But this is actually looking at Ukraine, and it's not looking at the Russia-Ukraine war. But what's interesting is they start talking about solar power, and this is from the Solar Energy Association Ukraine, and they said, war, it seems to us, created a new understanding of renewables and maybe also created possibilities for further development in renewables as well. But what the article goes on to, in more details, and I'll provide a link to everyone, it starts to talk about how people are becoming, sort of really, I'm trying to think of the word, but it's sort of ingenious in terms of they're sort of hooking up their own little solar power systems to their houses, create the power. And it's not just like the solar, most solar power systems like in the US and UK and across Europe is, we create power, we feed it to the grid, we sell our electricity back to say SDG&E, and then we have to buy it back at a premium another time. But the system's going like that. This is where they're basically putting the solar panels on the roof, little microgrid systems, what you're talking about here. And this is how they're actually creating electricity themselves. And what they're happening all over Ukraine where they've been struggling with energy is they're actually getting cheap solar panels and starting to put these things in place and creating distributed energy for their own electricity. It's exactly what you're saying, but basically just trying to, do it with wiring themselves, a couple of small solar panels. They're setting it up, creating basic electricity, getting lighting. Hopefully, this isn't going to be the end of the World War III. Hopefully they'll find a way to find peace with everything else that's happening out there in the world. It seems to be we go in waves of war and not so much war, even though the world's always sort of at some form of war or not. But really, do you think this is going to create this new wave of sort of distributed energy out the back of this? Because people are now going to start to think, and even people in Western countries, US, will start to think, well, wait a minute, I'm watching this in the news. I maybe should be creating my own energy and storing it myself. And that way, at least I'm in control. Or what do you think the future holds for us, Johnny?
No, I think that we are in the middle of a paradigm shift in the energy markets. And when you look at what's going on here in the United States, there's a big push to electrify everything. And we have a brilliant energy distribution system that was developed many, many, many years ago. And at the time, it was never anticipated that the energy demands would be anywhere close to what they are today. And so this energy distribution system they're having to create these Band-Aid fixes to bring it up to support our current energy demands. On one hand, we move to electrify everything, so there's greater energy demand. So where's that energy going to come from? Well, that creates a challenge, except now we have the ability to generate our own electricity at our own residence, at our own business. And so now that can't put an oil well or a coal fire plant in our backyard to generate electricity, but we can put solar panels on our roof and a wind turbine in our backyard and create the electricity that we need to run our home and to run our car. When you go to the Ukraine, now they're basically having to start over. And so they're approaching this, almost with a clean sheet of paper. Like, okay, we need to rebuild. And so how are we going to rebuild in a way that is leveraging modern technology that's going to be a smart energy mix for the future of the country? And what they're identifying is that, hey, it makes more sense to generate the power locally with solar systems. We're actually talking with NATO and about the use of our wind turbine in Ukraine to rebuild the country. And so there's a lot of advantages of moving in that direction. If you can free yourself from fossil fuels, that's a wonderful thing. If you can generate the power locally and avoid the need to put in these very expensive utility distribution systems, that's wonderful. And now with modern sophistication, both in the generation side and in computing, now my vision for the future of energy is that we have a number of distributed systems that are powering local microgrids, and those microgrids are interconnected in mesh networks, and they're managed with sophisticated, probably blockchain technologies that are managing the exchange of electrons for currency and keeping the overall energy structure alive and running. Something that is commonly overlooked is the amount of power that gets lost in utility distribution systems in the distribution process. Because of the friction in those power lines, the further you have to send that power, the more parasitic loss you experience through the distribution. And it's speculated here that in the United States, we lose somewhere between 25 and 50% of our generated power just in friction losses in the distribution, which, if you're making the power locally, you minimize that inefficiency.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the arguments that the offshore wind turbines as well. It's, you've got to put these things so far out to sea. The problem is that they want to keep a big offshore wind farms as close as possible to the land, because that's where the energy has to come back through giant power cables as well. But people need to realize is exactly what you're saying. It's the same giant power cables, huge, big, massive copper conductors that will bring in these. And if anyone's actually ever been to one of the big trade shows and you see the size of a power cable from a wind turbine or, an oil rig, these things are like, you can't even put your arm around it. There's so much copper in the middle, That's why the gypsies want to steal them. So that's like, that's it. I can't say it's Tyson Fury's a gypsy, so I don't want to bash them too much. If you start to think in terms of energy transmission, the other thing that works in coincides with that is the technology for information carried by satellites. Because before we used to have to run cables in terms of this cable, whether it was a fiber cable or copper cable, once we started going onto the internet. But you saw what Elon Musk did with using his satellites out in Ukraine. This allowed them to, transfer information as well. So, you've got distributed energy, but also the way we can actually access data now as well doesn't have to be through, central lines, whether it's copper, whether now it's fiber, and now it can all be done by satellite as well. So it really does change because, as you say, John, there's parts of the world whereby, economically, yes, we want to give these people electricity, but if there's only a few people live there and it's atop of some mountain and it's difficult to get to, and, it's where's the cost? There's no company out there can actually feasibly pay for it. Governments are always stuck with budgets. And then suddenly they can drop in your turbine, stick a satellite above, and then these people now can essentially get access to electricity, but also from electricity, they can get access to information, access to internet, access to all data. And it just changes everything so fast, whereby if you were looking back in the 80s and 90s, no one would believe you if such a system was in place.
Absolutely. The world's gone wireless and our energy needs to follow. What started with a remote control to control our TV from a distance, to our telephones, to our laptop computers, to our Wi-Fi internet. Hey, the world is wireless, and it makes sense to have our energy systems also break the chains of the utility power grid and become wireless in and of themselves. And as you mentioned, with the access to these satellite communications, this is the future.
I think from industrial power is going to be different because it's going to have to create so much power for, if you're making steel, stuff like that. And that's going to be the transition at the end from moving away from fossil fuels, especially if you think of like coal production's increasing in the world, but really coal production in China is increasing, in India. It's all for industrial power. But if you're looking at that, people need to actually split it in terms of whether the industrial plant's running or not. That's different to terms of, from an individual basis. And we shouldn't really be pulling our power from the same source, because we can all switch to sort of distributed power like that tomorrow. And we should be thinking about that. So people don't think about that. They think we've all got to be powered by the same thing. That, we need this big coal power plant in China that makes steel. But that power plant that makes steel doesn't have to power your home. And people need to realize there's so much more technology out there than just trying to mass it as one. Because in the past, if you're going back to the 50s and 60s, when we're all going through industrial revolutions, all the power came from coal power plants. And then became from, if we started using oil, you retrofit these things for gas, you start changing things like that. But again, that's powering all the homes. And I think what's so interesting about renewable energy and stuff that Uprise Energy is working on as well is, from an individual personal basis, you can create your own power. Therefore, when the grid goes down, you still keep going. Because even in a place like California, when it gets hot in the summer, we're getting alerts now, Johnny, saying that, we might have to switch the grid off for a few hours. We were lucky this summer because it wasn't so bad. But a couple of years ago, people were having rolling blackouts across the state. And, we were talking in this podcast about war in Gaza and the individual not getting access to electricity. And you saw these articles written back from like 2006, 2020, doing reports that people are essentially using candlelight. We just need to realize we need to move away from just having one energy source and start to take all the technologies out there and provide the energy for the individual, because the individual, that's us who's living. If the coal power plant's not making steel today, that might stop some building getting built, and that might something else delayed for a couple of weeks. But that shouldn't be the same as you at home where it's cold, or you at home where it's too hot, or you at home where you can't get access to just basic energy to power your fridge so you can feed yourself. We can move away from that tomorrow, people. And I think we've just got to realize that that's the future that's coming. And well, the future's here, Johnny. It's just a case of how long will it take for us to roll it out, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said. And you know, I know that I've been going on about the future of energy being distributed, but you're absolutely right. We're nowhere close to being ready to transition away from that commercial industrial power that's needed to, you know, power the big factories. You know, fossil fuel power is going to play a big role, but we do have alternatives, and which both represent solutions for our homes and developing some of these parts of the world that don't have, you know, access to this fundamental resource. You know, it's just like in Africa, where, you know, a lot of the community there, they never had a landline telephone because the infrastructure wasn't there to string together the telephone lines to get all of those villages so that they could get telephone. But now you go down there and virtually every person, regardless of where they live, they have a cell phone. And that's because they didn't have to put in the network. They were able to leverage these wireless cellular technologies to give them the communication that they needed. Well, that's very analogous to what's going on with the proliferation of distributed power, whether it be our wind turbine or distributed solar, same sort of thing.
And I know you guys are busy with Uprise. Is there anything else you want to talk about quickly just before the podcast finishes?
Well, yeah, we've been very busy. You know, we're talking about emergencies here, and so we're currently under contract with the California Energy Commission on a program that they call MORBUGs, Mobile Renewable Backup Generators. And so, what the Energy Commission, they've created a policy here in the state of California called Public Safety Power Shutoff. And what that refers to is, because of the wildfires that we've had here in the state of California, many of which have been caused by the utility power system. So fire season comes, a high wind event comes, knocks over a power line, and it sparks dry brush and creates a fire that then becomes, that then is devastating. Well, that has already literally bankrupted Pacific Gas and Electric. It nearly bankrupted San Diego Gas and Electric. And so our utilities are no longer going to take the risk of a utility power caused wildfire. And so if there is a weather condition that presents itself that could potentially create one of these emergencies, the power companies are going to proactively turn off the grid in the Public Safety Power Shutoff, PSPS. And now the Energy Commission, the body that oversees all of the regional public utilities, they are mandating that the public utilities be prepared for these future emergencies with alternatives to diesel generators for this emergency backup power. And so they issued 7 contracts on this MORBUGs program, and we happen to have 2 of the 7 right here at our Uprise factory. So we're building and demonstrating our portable wind system, and we're also building a portable hydrogen fuel cell trailer for this emergency response electrification. So it's pretty exciting. We've got 4 units under construction. Some of these units have some new features to respond to the specific needs. And literally today or tomorrow, we're going to take one of these units out and begin testing it. And we're going to be getting into some of our demonstrations with the Energy Commission. You know, this could be a real turning point for our company as we move into supplying these innovative power systems to respond to these modern day challenges that we have.
No, that all sounds good, Johnny. All sounds good. So, well, thanks very much for coming on the podcast again.
Hey, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and yeah, thanks to everyone out there. You know, I appreciate when you're speaking about climate change and war, and you know, we're looking at this from the West. But you know, I've got a lot of friends, Arabic friends, I've got Israeli friends, got Jewish friends, things like that. So, you know, everyone out there, stay safe, and then hopefully they'll find a solution to this one way or other. Okay, well, thanks again for Jonathan coming on the podcast.
Thank you. All right, take care.
And then thanks to everyone out there. You've been watching Boom It's on the Blockchain. My name's Alistair Caithness. Have a nice day.